Hello and welcome to another Daily Top 10's Top 10 video. Today we will be looking at the top 10 global risks of 2016.
Somebody will say, oh, freedom of speech, freedom of speech. These are foolish people. We have a lot of foolish people.
Number 10. Investment collapse in the oil sector prompts an oil price shock in future. Although this scenario has been deemed unlikely, the response of the world's oil-producing companies to lower the prices should create common concern about the long-term impacts this could have on the world's future energy supply. Currently, the production of about $400 billion worth of oil has been cancelled. Although the risk is low currently, the geopolitical environment in the Middle East and reduced investment in the sector provide an increasing risk.
And so the value of the dollar has been steadily rising over the last year and a half. Because oil is the only commodity traded worldwide in dollars, that means oil has become more expensive to OPEC's best customers, those in India, those in Asia. And so OPEC began to let the price fall to keep these economies from going into a recession.
Number 9. Chinese expansionism could lead to war in the South China Sea. In 2014, reports surfaced about Chinese vessels dredging atolls, rocks and reefs into artificial islands, and in some cases, military bases. According to the UN Convention's Law of the Sea, habitable and uninhabitable rocks have 12-mile territorial waters and a 200-mile exclusive economic area. China focused primarily on a group of 100 small reefs and islands known as the Spratly Islands. This is an issue, as there are also claims from Malaysia, Vietnam and the Philippines. Elsewhere, China is involved in similar debates over islands with South Korea and Japan. If this situation worsens, regional economic ties could be seriously undermined, and global trade flows could be potentially interrupted. Number 8. The Brexit. The UK has issued a number of demands to the EU regarding immigration, most notably. If the UK leaves the EU, it may help solve the migrant crisis. However, it could greatly affect the UK's GDP and the stability of the EU economically. If you want to know more about the Brexit in detail, please refer to the Brexit video on our channel, where we perform an in-depth analysis of the effects a potential Brexit may have.
Many of the newspapers you'll have seen just there are very much in favour of Britain pulling out of the European Union. For years they reflect this debate in the Conservative Party that actually Britain will be better off out because we're sick of going down a route towards an ever federal, a more closer union within Europe. The fact that maybe Europe wants to be a United States of Europe, like the United States of America, and a lot of people in Britain don't like that. However, when push comes to shove, Number 10 Downing Street are pretty sure that a lot of these newspapers, including the tabloids, may well back off that final decision of pulling out. In other words, they'll flirt with the idea of Brexit. They like the idea of keeping up pressure on Brussels, but when push comes to shove, maybe we're better off in.
Number 7. The rise of jihadi terrorism destabilising the global economy. After attacks in France, Belgium, Lebanon, Turkey, Indonesia and Egypt, the Islamic State remains a particularly difficult group to counter, despite considerable loss of territory in Iraq in recent months. The spread of IS influence poses a dilemma for global policymakers, who are under pressure to attack the IS in its Middle Eastern strongholds, but in turn risk attacks in their own countries. If these attacks continue to escalate, it would dent consumer and business confidence, resulting in a threat to end the 5-year price rise in both the European and US stock markets. Number 6. Donald Trump wins the US presidential election. Trump has built a strong lead in the Republican Party and looks to be the party's favourite candidate in the upcoming election. Though he has given few details of his policies and is prone to constantly revising them, several themes have become apparent. He is exceptionally hostile towards free trade, has taken an extremely right-wing stance on terrorism in the Middle East, and has a strong stance on immigration also. Though the odds are not in his favour for being elected as the US president, if he is elected, his policies are likely to escalate the world into a trade war and create a rise in jihadi extremism if he tries to ban Muslim travel to the US.
Total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. We have no choice. According to Pew Research, among others, there is a great hatred toward Americans by large segments of the Muslim population.
Number 5. Greece leaving the EU causes the Eurozone to break up. Though a third bailout last July removed the imminent danger of Greece leaving the EU, or Brexit, the country's future in the EU remains at risk. If the Brexit were to prompt other countries to leave the Eurozone, it would hugely destabilise the global economy due to those countries suffering large losses in GDP and no longer being able to help out with EU debts. The huge losses banks would suffer could plunge the world's economy into another recession.
Δεν έπεσε σήμερα στην Ελλάδα, είναι 5 χρόνια εδώ και έχει εγκληματικές ευθύνες για τη σημερινή κατάσταση πραγμάτων στη χώρα.
The country delayed a €300 million payment on the 5th of June, fueling more fears than of a Grexit. After several months of talks, the sides are still locked in deadlock over how best to tackle the crisis with no viable solution in sight. Greece says it won't accept more austerity cuts from its creditors, accusing lenders of being unreasonable.
Number 4. Internal and external pressures cause the EU to fracture. Mounting debts, differences of opinion about immigration, and fallout from terrorist attacks on European soil has raised doubts over the strength of the EU, and could have left it with its barriers reappearing all across borderless Europe. As a result, there has been a sharp rise in non-central political parties in some European countries. If the EU begins to fracture, we will see land borders reimposed, trade flows and economic cooperation between countries would be hindered also, harming growth of the economy, and leaving Eurozone states more vulnerable than ever in the event of another recession. Number 3. Currency volatility turns into emerging markets corporate debt crisis. In December of 2015, the US Federal Reserve implemented its first policy rate increase in almost a decade. The countries most vulnerable to the shifting monetary cycle will be those seen as lacking political and policy credibility, and those heavily reliant on commodity exports along with countries exposed to US trade. Any rolling emerging market debt crisis would cause panic across global capital markets and may need governments in several economies to step in and shield their banks from the fallout, risking a repeat of the banking crises witnessed in Europe at the start of the decade.
One sincerely hopes that common sense does prevail, because the ramifications of a debt default, I really think that many people actually haven't really thought through the full knock-on effect. And really what I mean there is, if you look at the US agencies for the last 100 years, the fundamental plank of their business policy has been the US government is the AAA. It's undoubted, and everyone else is benchmarked off them. So if you have a situation where there's a default, and I know Standard & Poor's, for example, have already said they will take it down to DD in the event of a default, assuming that they then apply consistent methodologies to what they've applied to everyone else in the world, they will then have to downgrade significantly all the corporate debts, because the sovereign has come down. That in turn will trigger various covenants in the loan agreements. This debt will not be allowed to be put into various portfolios, and it really could make the last crisis look tame.
Number 2. Russia's interventions in Syria and Ukraine lead to a second Cold War. The downing of a Russian jet by Turkey, the backing of the separatist war in Ukraine, and airstrikes in Syria mean that East-West relations are at their most strained since the end of the Cold War. This could seriously hinder a whole raft of shared policy goals, ranging from counter-terrorism to global warming, as well as holding the potential for escalation. Number 1. China experiences a hard landing. The current top global risk in terms of probability and impact is a sharp economic slowdown in China due to continued deterioration of the country's manufacturing and services sectors, the ongoing build-up of the country's debt stock, and continued capital outflows. If China's economy slows by more than we currently expect it to, it will further feed the ongoing global commodity price slump in raw materials. This will likely have a huge impact on South America, North Africa, and the Middle East. A prolonged deceleration will have a severe knock-on effect across the EU and the US.
President Xi said that China will continue to open up its markets, promote economic trade and investment, and participate in global economic governance. He noted the Chinese economy will maintain its strong momentum and unlock even greater potential for development. In the next 5 years, China is expected to import more than $10 trillion in goods, and its overseas investments will be more than $500 billion.
Thank you for watching another Daily Top 10's Top 10 video. Feel free to like, comment, share and subscribe, and as always, see you in the next video.